Cold Atlantic water lies against your skin in a sheltered Faroe Sound, cool and clear, with a faint taste of salt and stone. Above you, the surface is a pale, moving ceiling, broken by the last soft light of late summer. Long kelp blades lean with the tide, their edges folding and unfolding in slow green ribbons. Below them, basalt ledges step downward into dimness, dark rock softened by red algae, shell gravel, and drifting silt. The shadows here are not empty or still. They widen and narrow as clouds pass overhead, as waves turn the surface, as the kelp canopy sways. Along the thick stems, small amphipods cling close, grazing snails move quietly, and pale hydroids open into the current. A juvenile fish slips between two blades, pauses in the shaded water, then disappears toward the darker slope. So we follow that narrow corridor beneath the canopy, where the FAROE Kelp forest begins to reveal its hidden, patient life. The first change is small enough that you might miss it if you were looking only for movement among the fish. A band of darker green slides across the rock ahead, then thins, then returns, as if the forest is slowly closing and opening its eyes. It isn't a creature and it isn't the tide itself, but the combined motion of clouds, waves, and kelp blades bending above you. The shadow reaches the basalt ledge, crosses a patch of shell gravel, and dims the red algae for a few slow breaths. Then another shadow follows it, slightly wider, shaped by a different blade turning in the moving water. This is where we choose not to rise back toward the pale surface. We follow the dim corridor instead, because the shaded places are where the smallest lives have gathered. The slope beneath you is not smooth. It is made of dark volcanic stone, layered and broken, with steps and cracks left by old basalt flows, long cooled and long drowned. The Faroes rise from the North Atlantic as steep islands of ancient lava, and their underwater edges keep that same dark terraced shape. Here, beneath the sound, the ledges catch drifting gravel, bits of broken shell, and fine silt lifted by yesterday's swell. Kelp uses these ledges the way trees use a hillside, gripping wherever rock gives a firm place to hold. The large kelp here is mostly Laminaria hyperborea, a cold water kelp with a thick stipe and a broad divided blade. It doesn't root into the stone like a land plant. Instead, it fastens itself with a holdfast, a tangled, grasping base that clings tightly to basalt. The holdfast looks almost like roots, but it doesn't drink from the rock. It anchors the kelp in moving water, while nutrients pass directly across the kelp's living surface. That is one reason this forest can grow in such cold, clear water. The sea itself brings what the kelp needs. Nitrate, phosphate, carbon, and trace minerals arrive with each exchange of tide, carried through the sound from the open Atlantic. The kelp takes them in quietly, building long blades from light water and dissolved chemistry. Above you, the canopy leans again. Its blades fold over one another, and the light below breaks into pieces. A pale stripe touches the rock for a moment, then slides away. In that brief light, you see a cluster of small snails grazing over a film of algae. Their movement is nearly too slow to measure, but their work is constant. They scrape at surfaces with tiny rasping mouthparts, clearing paths through diatoms and young growth. Near them, a brittle star has placed two fine arms into the current. The rest of its body remains hidden under a stone lip. Its arms gather particles from the water, bending with delicate control, then drawing food inward by small degrees. Nothing here needs to hurry. The tide brings food, the rock gives shelter, and the shadows soften the world into layers. A small pollock, still young enough to seem almost transparent at the fin edges, appears beside a kelp stipe. It holds its place with gentle flicks of its tail. Then it tips sideways and slips behind the kelp, using the stem as a dark wall between itself and open water. The forest is not only a place to feed, it is a place to pause. The kelp stems create narrow rooms, and every room has a different flow of water. Some spaces are flushed by the tide, others are quiet pockets where silt gathers and larvae can settle. As you drift lower, the sound above becomes less like waves and more like a muted pressure all around you. There is no silence in the empty sense. There is the soft crackle of tiny animals, the low pulse of distant water, and the faint touch of suspended grains moving past your skin. The temperature stays cool, steady, and clean. Late summer has given the upper water some mildness, but the Faroe Sea still carries the character of the North Atlantic. It feels clear, mineral, and awake even as the light grows dimmer. Along one ledge, red algae spread in low branching mats and soft crusts. They are darker than the kelp, wine red and rust red, adapted to use the colors of light that reach lower through seawater. Green and yellow light fade with depth in their own way, but red algae are patient with what remains. They grow close to the stone, holding the understory together beneath the taller kelp. A small crab rests among them, legs folded, its shell mottled like the rock around it. It does not flee, it simply lowers itself a little, becoming more like the ledge. Nearby, pale hydroids open from a kelp stipe in tiny branching colonies. They look like delicate plants, but they are animals, relatives of jellyfish and corals. Each small feeding head waits in the current with fine tentacles spread. When particles pass, they close with a motion so slight it seems like a thought. The forest has many such almost invisible actions. A snail turns, a brittle star gathers, an amphipod shifts its grip on the kelp skin, a juvenile fish chooses shade over brightness, and that choice changes where it waits for the next small meal. You follow the same logic, staying within the shadow corridor, because the corridor is gathering evidence. More animals appear where the light is broken. The dimness gives them edges, and the current brings them food. The canopy above thickens as the slope turns inward toward a small hollow between basalt shoulders. Here the kelp stands closer together, the blades overhead overlap, and the last surface light arrives in long green fragments. When a wave passes above, the whole ceiling flexes, but down here the motion is delayed. The blades move first. Then the stipes bow. Then the shadow reaches the floor. This delay makes the forest feel as though it is breathing slowly through different depths. The flood tide is still entering the sound, but it has begun to lose some force. You can feel this in the way suspended silt no longer streams in straight lines. It turns softly near the rock. It circles behind the holdfasts. It settles for a breath, then lifts again when the next pulse of water arrives. The Faroe Islands sit where North Atlantic waters are rarely still for long. Tidal exchange threads through sounds and fjords, around headlands, and over submerged shelves of dark stone. Even sheltered water remembers the open sea. That constant exchange shapes where kelp can stand, how tall it grows, and how many animals can live within it. Too little movement and fine sediment may cover young plants before they attach well. Too much movement, and only the strongest holdfasts keep their place through winter swell. Here, in this sound, the balance is gentle enough for a forest, but strong enough to keep it breathing. You pass close to a kelp stipe thick as a wrist. Its surface is not bare. Small algae cling to it, and among them are amphipods, shaped like curved commas. They hold themselves tight with many legs, grazing and hiding in the same motion. A few are translucent brown, others carry faint green or reddish tones borrowed from the world they feed on. One loosens its grip and drifts a short distance. The current takes it under a blade, then into the fork of another stipe. It catches there, folds itself close, and becomes part of the texture again. This is how movement works in the understory, rarely straight, rarely far, always guided by the shape of water around stems and stones. The basalt ledge below drops by another low step. You descend with it, not quickly, but with the slow acceptance of gravity softened by sea. The shell gravel here is brighter than the rock. It gathers in pale pockets, made of broken mussel, barnacle, limpet, and older fragments worn smooth by tide. In the gravel, a small worm withdraws before its full shape is clear. Only a brief cloud of disturbed silt marks where it was. That little cloud rises, then spreads thinly under the kelp shade. A second later, a tiny fish turns toward it. The fish pauses, reads the water with its body, and takes something too small to see. Cause and effect here are quiet, but exact. A worm shifts. Silt lifts. A fish feeds. A hydroid closes. The tide moves all of it, one handspan farther along the ledge. Above, the kelp canopy opens briefly, and a brighter patch appears on the slope ahead. It might be tempting to drift toward it, because light gives the human eye comfort. but the brighter patch is open water between plants. The shadowed edge beside it is more full of life, so we choose the edge. We keep to the line where shade meets light, where animals can cross quickly between exposure and cover. The decision changes what becomes visible. At the edge of the patch, tiny snails cluster under the lip of a stone rather than on top. A young urchin, no wider than a coin, rests among red algae, its spines holding bits of shell and plant debris. A shrimp hangs nearly motionless beneath a kelp blade. Its antennae stretch forward into the current, reading what the eyes cannot. The forest is teaching the same lesson again. What seems empty from above is detailed from within. The canopy is a roof, but it is also a sieve. It filters light, slows flow, catches drifting material, and drops small pieces of itself into the understory. Old kelp tissue frays at the edges. Microscopic grazers take the softened parts first. Then larger fragments loosen and drift down to the floor, where other animals begin again. Nothing is wasted here. Even shadow has work to do. It protects some surfaces from too much light, shapes the growth of algae, and gives small fish a place to disappear. A long blade passes close over you, its surface marked by fine scratches and pale spots. These marks come from grazing, wear, and the season's long use. By late summer, many kelp blades have lived through months of growth, feeding animals and repeated bending in tide. They are strong but not untouched. Their edges are ragged in places. Small holes let the green water shine through. The forest is mature at this time of year, full and layered, but already preparing for change. Soon the days will shorten. Storms will begin to test the holdfasts more often. The canopy will lose pieces, and some old plants will be torn free. For now, though, the tide is mild, and the lake light still reaches the upper blades. The sound narrows ahead between two basalt shelves. Water slides through this narrow place with more definition. You can see it by watching the drifting particles. They do not fall straight down. They angle gently sideways, then gather in a thin line at the height of the kelp holdfasts. The visible blades above still lean in the old direction of the flood tide. But the particle line below has begun to move another way. This is the next small reveal. The deeper water is changing before the canopy admits it. Near slack tide, different layers can shift at different times, especially where rock channels and ledges guide the flow. The surface may seem to pause. The upper kelp may still point one way. Yet lower water, pressed through gullies and around stones, may begin turning sooner. The forest carries these changes in separate layers, like a quiet page being written from the bottom upward. We follow the particle line. It leads downward and slightly to the left, where the basalt forms a shallow runnel between ledges. The passage is only a few body lengths wide. Kelp stipes rise along both sides, and their holdfasts grip the rock like dark knuckles. Fine material travels through the runnel in a slow ribbon. Bits of red algae, tiny molts from crustaceans, grains of shell and living plankton all drift together. The current is weak, but organized. That organization is enough to make a feeding lane. A comb jelly appears in the dim water ahead, almost invisible until it turns. Rows of tiny beating plates along its body catch the last light and scatter it into faint moving colors. The colors are not its own glow. They are reflections, made by cilia bending light as they beat in sequence. The comb jelly pulses forward with no hurry, mouth end first, trailing fine sticky structures too delicate to see clearly. It follows the same particle-rich line you are following. Where the current gathers food, animals gather too. A few small pollock hold beside the runnel, facing into the movement. They do not chase. They wait, adjusting themselves with small tail beats. When a speck passes close enough, one fish opens its mouth, and the speck vanishes. Then the fish returns to its exact place, as though the water has placed it there, on the stone wall beside them, and an enemy opens in the softened flow. Its tentacles move independently, each one tasting the water. The body is pale cream, almost luminous against the red algae below. It has no need to roam through the forest. The tide brings the forest to it. This is one of the calmest forms of abundance, to wait in the right place, with the right shape, while water carries the world past. The flood tide weakens further. The kelp blades overhead begin to lose their firm angle, and their long bodies relax into a looser sway. The forest seems to exhale, not because the water has stopped, but because the force has spread into smaller paths. Around the runnel, the current separates into thin streams that touch different parts of the rock. One thread slips over the shell gravel, another curls behind a holdfast, a third rises gently along a kelp stipe, lifting fine particles into the dim green space beneath the canopy. You can see the tide most clearly in what it carries. A pale fleck of broken shell moves one way, hesitates, and then begins to turn. A strand of red algae follows more slowly, pulled by a different part of the same invisible hand. This is slack water approaching, but it is not stillness. It is a short interval when the forest becomes easier to read, because every small movement stands apart. The comb jelly drifts through the feeding lane, and its rows of cilia continue to shimmer with faint borrowed color. It passes above an anemone without contact, a glassy oval moving through a darker room. Behind it, the small pollock hold position for a little longer, then loosen their formation. One fish rises toward the canopy. Another turns sideways into the kelp stems. A third drops lower, close to the rock where the new current is beginning to gather. The animals are not reacting to a single command. They are responding to texture. Pressure against the body, particles against the mouth, dimness, vibration, and the changing taste of water. In the Faroe Sounds, the tide does not simply come and go like a smooth sheet. It folds around island slopes, squeezes through narrow channels, and slides across terraces of basalt. That means a kelp forest can hold more than one current at once. Near the surface, the water may still be finishing one motion. Near the floor, another motion may already be arriving. The forest is tall enough to register both. Its blades draw broad curves in the upper flow, while its holdfasts feel the first sideways pull below. This difference writes patterns into the whole place. It shapes where silt gathers. It shapes where filter feeders open, and where young fish choose to wait. A small cloud of plankton enters the runnel from the left, not as a visible swarm, but as a soft thickening of the water. The anemones sense it before the eye does. Their tentacles open a little wider. Hydroids along the kelp stipes turn their tiny feeding heads toward the moving line. A bryozoan crust on the rock lifts fine lophophores, delicate crowns of tentacles, into the stream. These animals are small, but together they make the forest floor responsive. When the water changes, the stone seems to bloom. You drift lower beside the runnel, following the particles as they slide between dark volcanic shoulders. The basalt here has a rough skin, broken into ledges, pockets, and small overhangs. It was once lava, poured in layers long before this sound was filled by the tide. Now those old flows have become shelves for kelp and rooms for animals. A deep crack runs across one ledge, its upper lip furred with red algae. Inside the crack, a shrimp holds itself nearly transparent against the shadow. Its eyes are dark points. Its antennae reach outward, longer than its body, bending with the slightest movement of water. It steps forward once, then stops. The motion is so small that the stillness around it feels deeper afterward. Nearby, a cluster of tube worms rises from the rock like pale threads. Only their feeding crowns show. The rest of each body is hidden in a narrow tube built from mucus, grains, and thyme. When a stronger ripple passes through the runnel, two crowns withdraw instantly. Then, slowly, one opens again. Then, the next. The forest resets itself in stages. Nothing returns all at once. Each animal waits for the water to feel right. A little farther down, the kelp stipes become more widely spaced, but their bases are larger. The holdfasts grip the stone in tangled masses, each one a dark knot of branching fingers. They are not roots, but they create the same impression of anchoring and shelter. Between the branches, there are openings only a few millimeters wide. To a small crustacean, those spaces are caves. To a larva, they may be the first protected place after drifting in open water. To a young urchin, they can be a slow, edible maze. The holdfast is one of the forest's hidden structures. From above, the kelp canopy seems to be the main event, broad blades moving in the light. But near the rock, each holdfast becomes its own dense neighborhood. Water threads through it. Sediment catches in it. Tiny animals hide, feed, grow, and are carried from one stem to another only when the current insists. You settle close enough to see the first holdfast clearly. Its surface is dark brown, nearly black where the light is weakest. Fine algae coat some branches. Small white spirals of tube-building worms decorate others. A tiny limpet clings to one smooth place, the shape of its shell matching the curve beneath it. An amphipod moves under a bridge of kelp tissue, then folds itself into a crack. Another creature, smaller still, flicks away from the holdfast and vanishes into the suspended particles. The more you look, the less the holdfast seems like a base. It becomes a miniature forest below the forest. There are trunks within trunks, shadows within shadows, edges, corridors, hollows, and narrow feeding places. A young urchin rests deep in one recess, partly covered by bits of shell. Its spines move slowly, each one testing the space around it. The urchin does not need to travel far to feed. Films of algae, fallen kelp fragments, and fine organic matter gather inside the holdfast. The tide delivers enough for a small life to continue. This is how the kelp forest holds abundance without noise. It gathers complexity in the quiet places, it builds shelter from motion, and then lets motion bring food through that shelter. You move along the row of holdfasts. Keeping low as the canopy sways above. The water has nearly paused at the upper level now. The blades hang in softer curves, no longer pulled hard in one direction. But below, the particle line keeps its sideways lean. The lower turn is becoming clearer. A stream of suspended grains moves through the runnel as if someone has drawn a pale thread along the floor. That thread passes through the holdfasts, and the animals open to it. A small sea squirt colony sits on the underside of a stone lip. Its bodies are simple, soft, and fixed in place. Each one draws water in through one opening and releases it through another, filtering fine particles as the tide moves through. They look almost motionless, but inside them, water is passing constantly. This is another kind of movement in the forest. Not the swing of kelp, not the turn of fish, the movement of water through bodies. A sponge nearby does the same work in a different form. It covers part of the basalt as an irregular pale patch, full of tiny pores. Water enters those pores, flows through narrow internal canals, and exits through larger openings. The sponge feeds by letting the sea pass through it. In this dim place, where leaves cannot grow thickly on every surface, animals that filter water become part of the landscape's breathing. The current strengthens by a small amount, not enough to disturb the holdfasts, enough to lift a thin veil of silt from the shell gravel. The veil rises ankle high, if this were land, then slides through the runnel and away. A small pollock drops into it and feeds twice. Then it returns to the darker side of a stipe. Above, the canopy remains calm, as though it has not yet received the message. The deeper forest is changing first. This quiet mismatch gives the whole scene a layered feeling. You are not only descending through space, you are descending through different clocks. The surface counts the tide in waves. The canopy counts it in bends and shadows. The holdfasts count it in particles, feeding crowns, and the slow opening of hidden animals. The rock counts it in sediment and attachment. The tide is not just water moving past a forest. It is a writer, arranging the forest sentence by sentence. It erases silt from one stone and lays it on another. It carries spores toward open rock. It brings plankton to anemones. It lifts fragments of kelp from the canopy and tucks them under ledges. It decides, without intention, which places are flushed clean and which become soft with settled matter. You follow one stream around a basalt shoulder where the runnel widens into a shallow basin. Here, the kelp stems stand like dark posts around the edges. The floor is mixed shell gravel and flat rock, covered by red algae in low mats. Small white shells lie in the hollows. Some are empty, some are occupied by hermit crabs, though at first they look like simple pieces of broken seabed. One shell begins to move. It tips forward, pauses, then advances on thin legs. The hermit crab inside carries its borrowed shelter carefully through the algae. Its claws test the surface before each step. When a shadow passes overhead, it withdraws partway, leaving only a still shell among still shells. Then it emerges again. The shadow was made by kelp, not by anything pursuing it. But in this forest, shade itself can be information. A change in light means something moved above. A careful animal does not need to know more than that. A second shell shifts nearby, and then a third. For a moment, the gravel seems to have slow thoughts. The basin gathers many small signs because the current softens here. Particles settle briefly, giving grazers and scavengers time to search. Then the new flow lifts the lightest grains again and carries them onward. The tide does not allow the basin to close. It keeps it connected to the rest of the sound. A loose fragment of kelp tissue drifts down from the canopy. It is small, no longer than your hand, with frayed edges and a torn surface. It turns once in the water, touches the red algae, and lifts again. An amphipod catches it for a moment, then the fragment slips loose and slides along the rock. Several animals register it. A snail changes direction. A small isopod appears from under a shell. The fragment is only a scrap, but it is also food, shade, and a sign of the canopy's slow wearing away. By late summer, the kelp forest has been building itself for months. Blades that grew strongly in spring are now marked by light, grazing, and current. Their older tissues soften first at the edges. Tiny grazers make trails across them. Storms and swell will later remove larger pieces. Even before winter arrives, the forest is beginning to give parts of itself back. That giving is not loss alone. It feeds the lower stones. It feeds hidden animals. It sends carbon from sunlight down into the dimmer parts of the ecosystem. The small kelp fragment reaches the basin's far edge and catches beneath a holdfast. A few amphipods gather there. Their bodies bend and straighten as they work over the surface. The fragment does not remain a blade for long. It becomes smaller pieces, then softer pieces. Then dissolved matter, bacterial growth, and fine particles that filter feeders can use. The forest eats itself gently, in the way all living landscapes do. A wave above sends a delayed pulse through the canopy. The stipes bend. The holdfasts hold. The basin darkens, then brightens, as several blades overlap in the path of the light. A shoal of very small fish appears near the upper edge of sight. They move as one loose shape, then split around a kelp stem and gather again behind it. Their bodies are silver grey, softened by green water. They are young enough to use the forest as shelter, but large enough to read its open spaces. They do not enter the lowest runnel yet. They remain halfway between canopy and floor. That middle layer is another room. The kelp forest is no longer a simple picture of plants on stone. It is a stacked place. Canopy above, stipes through the water, holdfasts at the rock, red algae and shell gravel below, cracks beneath that. And moving through all of it, the tide, the particles, the animals, and the light. You drift past the basin and into a narrower lane where the stipes stand closer. The upper blades now begin to swing in the new direction. The lower current has announced itself upward. One by one, the kelp plants accept the turn. Their long blades, which leaned with the last of the flood, begin to lift, loosen, and fold the other way. There is no sharp reversal. The forest changes its mind slowly. A blade rises from the left. Another drifts across it. The two surfaces touch, slide, and separate without sound. The shadows below shift into new shapes. Places that were dim brighten a little. Patches that were visible fall into deeper green. For the small animals, the map has changed. A limpet that was shaded now rests in a stripe of light. A shrimp that hung in open dimness is now hidden under a blade's shadow. A young fish leaves one stem and crosses to another, choosing the darker side. This is how the tide writes the forest again, not by moving everything far, by changing the relations between things. Light to rock, current to mouth, shadow to shelter, particle to feeder. You follow the new flow downward through the lane. The water now slips from behind you and over your shoulder, pressing lightly along the slope. It enters a gully between basalt stones where the kelp stems thin just enough to show the darker water beyond. This gully is deeper than the runnel before it. Its sides are rough and nearly vertical in places, with red algae clinging to the ledges. At the base, shell gravel has gathered in a pale ribbon. A brittle star lies partly exposed there, its central disc hidden beneath a flat stone. 3 arms extend across the gravel. 2 remain inside the crack. The extended arms lift and curl in the moving water, collecting small edible particles. When the current strengthens, the arms bend downstream but do not withdraw. They are built for this kind of place. Flexible, quiet, and able to turn flow into food. A nudibranch moves along the red algae near the brittle star. Its body is pale, with small, soft projections across its back. It travels slowly, almost as if the rock itself has started to creep. Many nudibranches feed on specific animals, such as hydroids, sponges, or bryozoans. Their colors and shapes often echo the food they live among. Here, in the green-black Faroe shade, subtlety is enough. The nudibranch moves across a hydroid stem and pauses. Its head lowers. The hydroid colony closes in tiny sections as contact reaches it. This small meeting is part of the hidden architecture of the forest. One animal grows on kelp, another feeds on that animal. A third hides among the branches left behind. The kelp itself provides the vertical structure that lets all of these relationships exist. It is easy to say the forest is made of kelp. It is more accurate to say the kelp makes room for a forest. The tide gathers again along the gully and carries you toward a darker stand. Here, the holdfasts are older and larger. Some are thick with encrusting life. Others have open spaces between their branching grips. You settle near one especially wide holdfast, and the world becomes very close. Its arches are small, but to the animals inside they are chambers. A polycate worm extends a red plume from one opening. The plume fans into the current, catches particles, and draws them inward. Then it withdraws so quickly that the space seems empty again. A tiny crab, no larger than a thumbnail, stands beside another opening. Its shell is mottled with brown and grey. One claw lifts and lowers, gathering something from the holdfast surface. Behind it, a cluster of young mussels has attached with fine threads. They are not large enough to form a bed. They are only a dark blue-black patch tucked into shelter. Some will remain. Some may be eaten, some may be dislodged when winter moves the forest more heavily. For now, they make the holdfast heavier with possibility. The holdfast collects beginnings, settled larvae, young grazers, soft films, tiny predators, fragments of shell. It is not permanent because the kelp plant itself will not last forever. But while it stands, it holds a small world together. You can sense the patience of that arrangement. Nothing in the holdfast asks to be seen from above. Its life is turned inward, toward cracks, fibers, and the passing of water. The new ebb current grows clearer. Particles now travel the opposite way through the corridor you entered. The route has reversed, but the forest has not become another place. It has revealed another side of the same place. Anemones that faced one direction now bend another. Fish shift to the upstream side of stems. Loose kelp scraps that had gathered under one ledge lift and drift toward another. The tide's reversal turns sheltered backs into feeding fronts. It turns shaded rooms into open lanes. It makes the animals rearrange themselves without leaving home. A shoal of Sather enters the upper forest. At first, there is only a dimming above, broader and smoother than a passing kelp blade. Then the fish come into view, long-bodied and silver-dark, moving together with calm precision. They are not racing, they fold through the stems in one continuous motion, each body keeping distance from the next. The light beneath them lowers. For several breaths, the understory becomes duskier. The small pollock drop closer to the rock. A shrimp backs into a crack. The hermit crab stops with one leg lifted. The nudibranch continues, too slow to answer quickly, but its feeding surface lowers against the algae. The Sather pass like weather. Their shoal bends around the kelp trunks, opens, closes, and reforms. Their bodies catch faint light along their sides, then lose it again in the green shade. They belong to the larger water, the space beyond the forest, but they use this canopy edge as a corridor. For a moment, the forest is connected to the open Atlantic through their movement. Then the shoal turns upward and away. A few young fish follow their shadow for a short distance, then stop. We do not follow the Sather. Instead, you settle lower, where the passing darkness has left the holdfasts quiet and alert. The Sather have moved on, but their shadow remains for a little while in the behavior of smaller animals. A shrimp stays folded inside its crack, antennae still extended, reading the water before it trusts the open space again. The hermit crab lowers its lifted leg, touches the gravel, and waits one more breath before moving. The tiny crab on the holdfast turns sideways, making its body narrow against the kelp's dark branches. This is not panic. it is attention. In the understory, every change of light is information, and every shadow has to be understood before life opens again. The forest does not return all at once after the shoal passes, it returns in small decisions. A hydroid opens one feeding head, then another. A brittle star lifts the tip of an arm from the gravel and lets the current touch it. A young pollock leaves the deepest side of a stem and rises just enough to face into the ebbing water. The kelp above continues its slow turn, accepting the new direction of tide. The blades now lean with the outgoing flow, and their shadows stretch differently across the slope. What was sheltered a few minutes ago now lies in a softer brightness. What was visible has become a green-black pocket. The animals do not need to understand the whole forest to move well within it. They only need to read the next edge, a brighter patch, a darker hollow, a stronger thread of water, a scent of torn kelp, a vibration from fish passing above. You remain close to the rock, where these small messages are easiest to see. The holdfast beside you is thick with old growth, its branches worn smooth in places, roughened in others by encrusting animals. Some parts are clean and dark, rubbed by moving gravel or by the bodies of grazers. Other parts are pale with tiny tubes and crusts, each one a record of something that settled and remained. A small chiton clings to one lower branch, its shell plates overlapping like a quiet suit of armor. It grazes slowly over the surface, rasping at the fine film that grows where light and nutrients meet. Its motion is almost invisible, but over time it changes the texture of the kelp base. Beside it, an amphipod feeds in quicker strokes, bending forward, scraping, then backing into a crease. Two different bodies work on the same surface at different speeds. The chiton measures time in long, steady pressure. The amphipod measures time in flickers. The holdfast holds both. This is one reason the base of the kelp feels older than the canopy. The blade above grows, frays, and tears in broad movements. The holdfast below gathers details slowly, letting life collect in protected angles. It is not a single shelter. It is a crowded architecture of almost rooms. One opening leads into a narrow tunnel filled with silt and shell fragments. Another leads to a clean channel where water moves faster. A third holds a young urchin, a worm tube, and a few loose pieces of red algae pressed together by the tide. Each chamber has its own current. Each current brings a slightly different meal. You drift inches above the base, close enough to see how the outgoing tide bends through these tiny passages. Suspended grains enter the holdfast on one side, slow in the branching maze, then leave from another opening in a thinner stream. Some particles catch on rough surfaces. Some are taken by feeding crowns, some settle into hollows and become part of the stored softness inside. The kelp plant is alive, but so is the space it makes. Its form changes the water, and the changed water changes who can live there. That is the quiet cause and effect beneath the canopy. Shape makes current, current brings food, food brings animals. Animals graze, filter, hide, and settle, altering the shape again. A very small nudibranch, smaller than the first, appears on a pale hydroid colony attached to the stipe. Its body is the color of watered milk, with faint golden tips on its soft projections. It moves with slow certainty, following the branching hydroid as though following a path already known. When it feeds, it takes not only food, but sometimes the stinging cells of its prey, storing them in its own tissues. The detail is small, but precise. Even here, in shadow, life carries borrowed tools. The hydroid closes along the line of contact. The nudibranch continues. Above them, the kelp blade lifts and lowers, but the small eater does not look up. Its world is a few centimeters wide and complete. A pulse of stronger ebb water enters the lane, and the holdfast shivers at its outermost branches. It does not release. The whole plant has been built by this motion, strengthened by years of bending. Laminaria hyperborea can stand through heavy water because its parts give way without breaking too soon. The flexible blade reduces force by streaming with the current. The stipe bends. The holdfast spreads its grip across the rock. Around the Faroes, where winter swells can arrive with long power from the Atlantic, that grip matters. Only attached kelp can make a lasting forest. Spores may settle on many stones, but only some young plants grow where they can hold against time. The strongest places are often the roughest ones. Basalt ledges, cracks, and uneven faces offer points of attachment. Smooth stones may be too easily scoured. Soft sediment gives no secure hold. So the forest follows the geology. The ancient lava beneath you does not merely sit under the ecosystem. It decides where the canopy can begin. A kelp forest on sand would be a different thing, or no forest at all. Here, the old volcanic rock rises in steps, and each step gives kelp another place to stand. Between the steps, shell gravel lies loose and pale. No large kelp anchors there, but the gravel has its own life. Worms pass beneath it. Small crustaceans slip between grains. Broken shells hold films of bacteria and algae. Tiny bivalves may bury just below the surface, feeding through narrow openings into the water above. The forest floor is not one habitat. It is a mosaic held together by current. Rock for attachment, gravel for burrowing, cracks for retreat, stipes for height, glades for shade. Holdfasts for hidden rooms. You move slowly along the boundary between hard ledge and shell gravel, and the animals change with each handspan. On the rock, limpets and encrusting algae dominate the surface. In the gravel, small burrowers leave faint openings and lifted grains. On the kelp stipes, hydroids and bryozoans spread like delicate frost. In the open water between, fish hold themselves in place, facing the tide. The forest is layered vertically, but it is also patched sideways. A few inches can mean a different way of living. This is why staying low reveals so much. From above, the kelp canopy would look continuous. From here, it is full of borders. A border between shadow and light. A border between rock and shell. A border between still pocket and moving lane. A border between the open gully and the shelter of a holdfast. Each border gathers movement. Animals cross them carefully, because edges offer both food and cover. A small pollock approaches the gravel ribbon, takes a particle from the water, and returns to the dark side of a stipe. A shrimp extends farther from its crack now, trusting the water again after the safer shadow. It steps onto the rock face, transparent legs touching red algae and bare basalt. Its antennae sweep ahead. Then it takes a small piece from the surface and brings it inward. The movement is so precise that it feels almost domestic, a life tending its own narrow threshold. The larger shoal has gone, but the understory has remembered its passing and adjusted. Now, slowly, the holdfast rooms reopen. Tubeworm crowns appear again. Hydroids expand. The hermit crab resumes its careful walk across the gravel. The forest becomes itself again, not by forgetting disturbance, but by absorbing it. This is how many quiet ecosystems endure, not by remaining unchanged, by changing gently, repeatedly, and returning to a workable pattern. The tide continues to strengthen in the ebb direction. Water now travels more clearly down the gully, carrying particles toward the darker slope below. You follow the same line, staying near the bottom, where the kelp stems begin to spread farther apart. The canopy above is still present, but it is less continuous. Openings appear between the blades. Through them, dim light arrives in wider patches and moves across the rock in slow, wavering ovals. One oval settles ahead, brighter than the surrounding floor. At first, it looks like a simple opening in the canopy, then the shape of the rock beneath it becomes clearer. There is a pale mark on the basalt, nearly oval, cleaner than the surfaces around it. The mark lies where a large kelp holdfast once gripped the stone. Now the plant is gone. The old kelp has torn free, and its absence has opened a small clearing in the forest. The missing plant changes the whole room around it. There is no thick stipe rising from the pale scar, no broad blade crossing the water above, no holdfast maze for amphipods and young urchins, no dark branchwork collecting silt and larvae in its hollows. Only exposed rock, newly brightened by the lifting of shade. The clearing is not large. Perhaps a single old kelp plant once filled this space with its stem and canopy. But in a forest made of shade, the loss of one plant is enough to change the light. A strip of wavering brightness reaches the basalt and touches the red algae around the scar. The beam trembles with the surface. It lengthens when the blade nearest it lifts. It narrows when another blade drifts over. The pale oval remains, clear and still beneath the moving light. This is the first change here that cannot simply reverse with the tide. The current can turn, fish can return, hydroids can open again after closing. But this kelp plant will not reattach. Once the holdfast is torn away, the old individual is gone from the rock. It may drift elsewhere as food, it may lodge lower on the slope, sheltering small animals for a while. It may break apart into fragments that feed grazers, bacteria, and filter feeders. But the canopy space it held has been opened. The forest must answer that opening in time. You settle at the edge of the scar, where old shade meets new light. The basalt inside the oval is smoother than the surrounding rock, as if the holdfast protected it from some growth while it lived there. Around the edge, tiny torn remnants remain, dark threads and rough patches where the grip once held. A few amphipods move among these remains, searching surfaces newly exposed. A limpet approaches from the red algae border, its shell low and grey. It crosses into the brighter patch slowly. Its body extends beneath the shell, soft and strong, gripping the basalt with a broad foot. It grazes over the scar, scraping at the first thin films that have formed there. The missing kelp has made room for grazers. The grazers, in turn, will influence what can settle next. If they scrape too intensely, new spores may struggle. If they graze lightly, they may clear the surface enough for young algae to attach. A clearing is not empty space. It is an argument in slow motion, written by light, grazing, and arrival. The exposed rock receives more light than it did yesterday. That light encourages microscopic algae, diatoms, and early films to grow. Spores of kelp and red algae may drift through this patch with the tide. Some will touch the stone and fail. Some will be eaten. Some will be buried by silt. Some may hold. If a young kelp recruit settles here, it begins as something almost invisible, a tiny life stage far from the broad canopy above. Kelp has a life cycle with alternating forms. The large kelp you see is the sporophyte, the familiar plant with holdfast stipe and blade. It releases microscopic spores into the water. Those spores can grow into tiny male and female stages, which later produce a new young sporophyte. The grand blade begins as a small hidden generation. The canopy, in that sense, is prepared in miniature. In places like this scar, the future forest may already be present before the eye can recognize it. The pale oval waits. Water crosses it in the new ebb direction, carrying spores, silt, and small animals across the bare surface. A tiny snail reaches the clearing, pauses at the edge of brightness, then turns along the border rather than crossing the middle. Its choice draws a curve around the scar. A shrimp crosses differently. It rises slightly from the rock, drifts across the open light, and lands beside a loose piece of red algae. A juvenile fish approaches from one kelp stem, hesitates in the brighter space, then darts across to the next shadow. Each animal treats the clearing according to its own body. The limpet moves through it as feeding ground. The snail uses the edge. The shrimp crosses in a lifted glide. The fish treats it as open water, brief and exposed. Though nothing here is rushing, the same patch of rock becomes many landscapes at once. This is the clearing's first consequence. It forces movement to become visible. In unbroken shade, animals can pass through soft darkness with little contrast. Here, each crossing is drawn by light. A brittle star arm emerges from beneath a nearby stone and reaches toward the clearer flow. It does not enter the bright center. It only samples the edge, curling and uncurling where particles pass over the scar. Hydroids on the surrounding stipes now receive water that moves differently because the large plant is gone. The missing stem no longer slows the current. The flow through the clearing is smoother and a little faster. Particles that once would have caught in the old holdfast now pass onward. Some filter feeders downstream may gain from that. Some animals that lived inside the holdfast have lost shelter. A single absence has many directions. You look upward through the gap where the blade used to be. The surface is far above, pale and broken. Other kelp blades still cross the view, but they do not fill it completely. The clearing makes a window in the forest roof. Late summer light enters through that window with a soft green cast. It falls on basalt that may not have felt direct canopy-filtered brightness for years. The rock does not respond quickly. but the films on it will. Diatoms can grow within days when conditions suit them. Bacteria colonize surfaces almost immediately. Spores arrive with ordinary water. The first layer of renewal is not dramatic. It is slippery, thin, and nearly transparent. A limpet's grazing track may decide part of it. A silt veil may cover part. A young red alga may take hold near the scar's edge, where light is gentler and grazing less intense. Later, if a kelp recruit survives, its holdfast will begin as a tiny grip on the same stone. The forest remembers through surfaces, not with thought, with attachment. The old holdfast leaves a clean mark. The new spores read that mark as available space. The current brings what might settle. The grazers decide what remains long enough to grow. The clearing is a wound, only if viewed too quickly. Viewed at the speed of the forest, it is also a beginning. The missing kelp has become room. You drift across the clearing slowly, following the path of the shrimp rather than the fish. The brighter water feels cooler somehow, though the temperature has not changed. It is the sensation of openness within shade. Above, the canopy edges move like curtains around the gap. Each passing blade reshapes the light. The pale oval appears, disappears, and appears again. A small group of amphipods gathers near one torn remnant of holdfast tissue. They feed over the softened edge, taking what remains of the old plant. The last pieces of the former kelp are not wasted. They become food for animals that may also carry nutrients through the clearing. An isopod crawls beneath a loose fragment and stops there, using it as temporary shelter. A young urchin approaches from the red algae border, its spines carrying bits of shell and plant debris. The urchin's tube feet reach out between the spines, touching, tasting, holding. It moves toward the scar with slow insistence. If it grazes over the newly opened rock, it may slow the settlement of some algae. If enough young urchins gather, they can change the balance of a patch. Here, there is only one small and almost hidden under its carried fragments. Still, its presence matters. In the scale of a clearing, small grazers are large forces. The urchin pauses at the edge of the bright oval. A kelp shadow crosses it. For a few seconds, it disappears into the old green-black pattern. Then the light returns, and the urchin is still there, moving one spine length at a time. The scar has drawn together grazers, scavengers, drifting larvae, and filtered light. It has become a small center of attention. Around it, the forest adjusts its edges. The closest kelp plants bend into the open water, their blades sometimes overlapping the gap but never filling the missing holdfast's place. Their shadows cross the scar, but their bases remain rooted elsewhere. The opening also changes the sound of the water, though only in the softest way. Where the old stipe once divided the flow, the ebb now passes as one smoother sheet. Fine particles cross the pale oval without circling, then gather again behind a neighboring holdfast. That small difference gives the downstream animals a new feeding pattern. A hydroid colony, fixed to the next kelp stipe, opens more fully into the redirected current. Its tiny heads face the flow, each one waiting where the old plant no longer interrupts the water. This is how absence becomes structure. Something missing can guide movement as clearly as something present. The clearing does not widen while you watch it, but its effects reach outward. One kelp plant is gone, and the forest has already begun to reorganize around the gap. A red alga at the lower edge lifts and lowers in the smoother flow. Its branching surface catches particles, then releases most of them downstream. A few grains settle in the scar, but the rock remains mostly clean. Clean rock is rare in a mature kelp forest. Most surfaces are occupied, shaded, grazed, coated, or covered. Here, the newly exposed basalt is like an open page. The tide writes across it with spores, silt, and passing feet. A limpet leaves a faint grazing track behind it, invisible at first, then clearer when light crosses the surface sideways. That track is not a wound. It is a preparation. By removing the first thin film, the limpet may make room for some settlers and prevent others. Another grazer may follow the same line later, deepening the path, or the path may be covered by diatoms before the next tide turns. Nothing about the clearing is decided yet. It is only available. That availability draws the forest's future toward it. A small strand of kelp tissue, perhaps from the torn holdfast, lifts from one edge and drifts across the scar. It catches on a rough place in the basalt, trembles, then breaks loose again. Two amphipods follow it for a moment, then abandon it when the current takes it beyond the light. Their bodies vanish into the red algae border. The clearing brightens. Then a blade from a neighboring kelp sweeps across the window overhead, and the brightness dims. The open patch returns to shadow, but the shadow is thinner than before. Even when shaded, the gap still holds a different kind of darkness. It is not the deep-rooted shade beneath the full canopy. It is a moving shade, temporary and porous. A juvenile fish seems to know the difference. It crosses the patch when the blade overhead is passing, using the brief dimming like a curtain. When the light opens again, the fish is already on the other side. Its body settles beside a stipe, fins making small corrections against the ebb. The fish does not understand the history of the missing kelp. It understands cover. It understands distance. It understands that one shadow is safer than another because it touches something solid. The forest is full of such practical knowledge. No single animal sees the whole pattern, yet each one responds to its part. The limpet knows the rock by taste. The shrimp knows the water by touch. The hydroid knows the current by the arrival of food. The young fish knows the shape of shelter by light against its body. Together, these small readings become the behavior of the clearing. You linger beside the pale oval because change is easier to see here. In the surrounding forest, renewal hides inside the ongoing shade. But in the gap, every beginning has an edge. A thin brown film already softens one corner of the exposed basalt. It may be diatoms, bacteria, settled organic matter, or all of them together. Such films are the first skin of many underwater surfaces. They prepare the rock chemically and physically, making it less bare than it appears. Larvae and spores often respond to these films. Some settle because a surface has the right texture. Some avoid it because another organism has already claimed the space. The forest's future may depend on layers too thin to see. A small bubble, trapped beneath a torn piece of algae, rolls along the stone and disappears into the water. The bubble might have come from photosynthesis higher in the canopy, or from air caught in the plants near the surface. It rises slowly, trembling through the green water. Above it, the kelp blades continue to lean with the ebb. The old plant is gone, but the neighbors still shape the sky. Their blades sometimes overlap, making the clearing vanish for a breath. Then they separate, and the pale scar returns. This repeated covering and uncovering matters. A young recruit growing here would not receive steady sunlight. It would receive pulses. Green brightness, shadow, green brightness again. Kelp is well suited to this shifting light because it lives in moving water. Its tissues can use low light efficiently, especially in clear northern seas. But a tiny recruit is still delicate. It must attach firmly, avoid being buried, avoid being grazed too early, and gather enough light to grow. The gap offers opportunity, but not certainty. That is the quiet tension of the clearing. Not danger, not drama, only many small conditions waiting to align. A hermit crab approaches the lower edge of the scar, carrying a pale shell worn smooth on one side. It stops when the current strengthens over the exposed rock. The crab's legs test the surface, then draw back. Instead of crossing the center, it turns toward the gravel pocket beside the scar. There, it finds a narrower route through broken shell and red algae. The crab chooses texture over openness. Its shell knocks lightly against a pebble, and a faint puff of silt lifts. The puff drifts over the pale oval. For a moment, the clean mark is veiled. Then the current takes the silt away, and the scar returns again, unchanged but newly touched. This is how the forest rearranges material. A crab steps, a particle lifts, a hydroid feeds, a film receives a grain. A future attachment place becomes slightly different. Everything is small, but nothing is separate. You follow the silt veil as it leaves the clearing. It moves toward the downstream side, where the old holdfast no longer catches it. The veil threads between two younger kelp plants and settles briefly along a red algae mat. Tiny feeding arms rise from the mat, almost at once. A brittle star hidden beneath it has sensed the passing food. One arm extends into the current, then a second. The rest of the animal remains under cover. The clearing has fed a creature that did not enter it. This is another consequence of the missing kelp. Matter moves differently. Food reaches different mouths. Shelter changes shape. Light falls where it did not before. The old plant's absence is not contained within the pale oval. It is distributed through the water. The tide carries that absence outward. A narrow blade from a neighboring kelp brushes the edge of the scar. Its tip is frayed, with small notches along the side. When it touches the rock, a few amphipods release and swim for an instant. They arc through the brighter water, then settle into shadow again. Their movements are quick, but they stay close to the forest's surfaces. Open water is only a short crossing for them. The blade lifts away, leaving the scar open again. A young red alga clings near the upper edge, no longer than a fingernail. Its color is deep wine in the filtered light. It may have been growing before the old kelp fell, hidden under the holdfast's outer shade. Or it may have settled after the clearing formed. Either way, the new light now reaches it more often. It will not become the canopy. It will belong to the lower layer, spreading close to the basalt. But even that small growth will shape who uses the edge. A snail may graze it. A larva may settle beside it. A shrimp may shelter under it when it becomes branched enough. The forest's renewal will not be a single replacement. It will be a sequence of occupations. Film first, then small algae and grazers. Then perhaps kelp recruits, if spores arrive and hold. Then a young stipe, if the recruit survives the grazers. Then a blade that begins to cast its own shadow. And only much later, if time and weather allow, a new holdfast maze. The clearing may return to canopy, or it may remain open longer. It may become a patch of red algae, it may be scraped by grazers, it may be shaded by neighboring kelp before a new plant gains height. The forest does not restore itself to a fixed design. It answers conditions. The ebb tide strengthens by another soft degree. You can feel it in the particles now, which move with more confidence across the gap. The clearing's light becomes more active, because the surrounding blades lean farther in the new direction. Shadows stretch downstream, longer and narrower than before. The pale oval begins to sit inside a moving lattice of shade. It looks less like a wound now, and more like a threshold. Animals cross it from one kind of forest into another. On one side, holdfast rooms remain dense and older. On the other, exposed rock waits under wavering light. A small pollock uses the cleared space as a shortcut, passing through at mid-height. It turns once, takes a tiny drifting animal from the water, and slips behind a younger stipe. A shrimp follows near the floor, walking rather than swimming. Its antennae touch the basalt ahead, then sweep the empty water. When it reaches the center, it stops. The shrimp stands in full view on the pale scar. Its transparent body almost disappears against the moving brightness, except for dark eyes and fine red-brown markings. Then a kelp shadow covers it. In that instant, the shrimp becomes visible by silhouette. It moves again, crossing into the red algae border. The clearing makes visibility change in layers. Brightness hides some bodies and reveals others. Shadow does the same. The forest is not simply light above and dark below. It is a constant exchange between seeing and being hidden. A few grains of sand roll across the basalt, then stop behind a tiny ridge. The ridge may be a remnant of old volcanic texture or the base of an encrusting organism worn down by grazing. Either way, it is enough to catch sediment. If more grains gather there, they may create a small pocket where some spores fail and others find moisture and shelter. The smallest reliefs matter underwater. Flow slows behind them. Chemistry differs there. Grazers turn around them. Larvae touch them and decide, in the language of their bodies, whether to remain. The Faroe basalt is rough with such decisions. Its ancient surfaces, cooled from lava long ago, now hold the beginnings of algae, animals, and whole forest rooms. A soft clump of detached red algae rolls into the clearing and catches near the lower edge. Immediately, the water pattern changes around it. Particles collect upstream. A tiny amphipod slips beneath it. The urchin turns toward it, or seems to, moving with slow adjustments of spines and tube feet. Temporary shelter has arrived. It may remain for minutes. It may leave with the next stronger pulse. In that time, it changes the clearing. The pale scar is no longer only exposed rock. It is rock plus drifting debris, grazes, moving shade, and the first colonizing film. This is how new patches become complicated. Not by becoming large, by receiving many small arrivals. The clump of red algae lifts, twists, and moves onward. The amphipod releases from beneath it and darts into a crack. The urchin continues forward, undisturbed by the loss. The current carries the clump toward the gully below, where the water grows darker. You watch it go, then return your attention to the scar. It is tempting to wait until something decisive happens. A spore settling, a recruit appearing, a new plant beginning. But the forest does not offer those moments on human time. Its important events are often hidden in days, seasons, and microscopic stages. What you can see now is the condition being prepared. The old holdfast is gone, the light has changed, the flow has changed, the grazers have arrived. The rock is open. That is enough. A landscape has turned a page. You drift to the far side of the clearing, where the slope resumes its older shade. Looking back, the pale oval now sits behind you, partly dimmed by crossing blades. It seems smaller from this angle, less central. Already the surrounding forest is absorbing it into pattern. But if you followed the current tomorrow, and the next day, and through autumn, the scar would keep mattering. New films would thicken or be grazed away. Spores would pass with each tide. Fine sediment would settle during calmer water and lift during stronger flow. A winter swell might tear more plants nearby, enlarging the opening. Or the neighboring kelp might survive, keeping the gap small and shaded. The story has begun, but it has not resolved. The forest holds that uncertainty quietly. As you move away, the old clearing remains behind, like a soft window in the canopy. Its brightness still flickers through the stems. Ahead, the kelp becomes denser again. The basalt slope bends inward, and the water deepens by a little. The stipes stand in darker rows, their bases thick with holdfasts and attached animals. The upper blades now lean steadily with the ebb, drawing long green-black shadows over the rock. The light above the surface is changing too. Evening is approaching over the islands. You cannot see the cliffs from here, but the water knows the sky is dimming. The green light loses some gold. The pale surface becomes grayer. The forest's shadows, once separate bands, begin to merge. Where the clearing held a clear window, the path ahead gathers dusk early. Under a kelp canopy, evening arrives before it arrives in open water. The blades take the last brightness and make it softer. They spread it into moving strips and then into a deep, continuous shade. The red algae lose their red tones first. They become dark velvet against darker stone. The shell gravel remains faintly visible, a pale scatter along the runnel. Fish bodies no longer flash silver. They become shapes, slight turns, changes in density. The forest is becoming less visual. Other senses begin to feel more important. The current against skin, the pressure of water in the ears, the fine touch of particles drifting past, the tiny sounds of small animals feeding and moving among hard surfaces. Sight is not leaving all at once. It is simply giving up its authority. The deeper color of the Faroe Sound settles around you. Above, the canopy sways, but its blades are now nearly the same shade as the water behind them. Only their edges remain distinct. A young pollock moves from one stem to another, not in quick flight, but in a careful lowering. It chooses a place close to the rock, behind a holdfast, where the outgoing tide brings food and the darkness gathers early. Other small fish settle in similar ways. They do not vanish. They become part of the stems and shadows. The daytime feeding lanes are still present, but the forest's behavior begins to shift. Shrimp that waited deep in cracks now extend farther out. Their antennae search the water beyond the openings. Tiny crabs move along kelp bases with less hesitation. A sea urchin at the edge of the clearing begins to graze more openly, its spines carrying fragments that make it look like a moving piece of the floor. Nocturnal life does not wait for complete darkness under a canopy. It begins when the light falls below a certain comfort. In these shaded Faroe stands, that threshold arrives early. The first shrimp leaves its crack fully. Its body is almost glass clear, with fine lines inside where organs and muscles catch the remaining light. It steps onto the basalt, pauses, then lifts its claws to the red algae. A second shrimp appears from the underside of a ledge, then a third, smaller one emerges from the holdfast branchwork. Their arrival is not a swarm. It is a gentle increase in presence. The forest floor becomes more animated, while the midwater fish become stiller. Day and night overlap here for a long time. Some animals are settling, others are beginning. The same tide carries both. You drift with the ebb into a darker stand beyond the clearing. The water has the quiet feeling of a room after lamps have been lowered. Kelp stipes rise around you like dark posts. The blades above make a roof that no longer shows individual greens. The rock floor dips into a shallow hollow lined with shell fragments and old kelp debris. Here, a loose blade from somewhere higher has caught against a stone. It is wider than the earlier scrap, torn along one edge, its surface olive brown and worn thin in places. Small animals have already found it. Amphipods cluster along the torn margin. A snail grazes near a pale patch. The blade moves slightly with each pulse of ebb, lifting and settling without leaving the hollow. This fallen piece is part of the canopy's slow descent into the understory. It carries sunlight's work downward. The carbon built in the blade will not remain blade-shaped for long. Grazers will scrape it. Bacteria will soften it. Small crustaceans will shred it. Bits will enter the water again as particles, drifting to filter feeders. Some dissolved matter will be used by microbes. Some larger fragments may travel below the kelp forest entirely. A forest does not only stand and grow, it sheds. It feeds the ground beneath it. It sends pieces of itself into neighboring habitats. The torn blade in the hollow rises again, then folds over the stone. Under its edge, a shrimp explores the temporary darkness. It disappears beneath the kelp tissue, then backs out. The blade has become shelter, food, and moving shade at once. A small crab grips the surface and tears at a softened area. Its motion is slow but purposeful. When the blade lifts, the crab holds on, riding the movement without being carried away. This is another afterlife of the canopy. Detached kelp continues to shape behavior after it has left the plant. The hollow around the blade darkens as evening settles farther into the sound. The torn kelp surface gleams faintly where it bends, then dulls again when shadow covers it. A snail crosses from the rock onto the blade, feeling the change from hard basalt to living tissue. Its mouthparts begin to scrape, leaving a narrow pale line through the softened film. The blade no longer grows, but it is still full of stored summer. It holds sugars, fibers, minerals, and the memory of months of light moving through cold water. Now those stored things pass into other bodies, one slow bite at a time. A cluster of amphipods works along the torn edge, where the tissue is easiest to enter. They do not eat the strong middle first. They begin where wear and bacteria have already opened the surface. This is how decomposition often starts in the kelp forest, not as a single event, but as a partnership. Breakage exposes tissue. Microbes soften it. Grazers and shredders make it smaller. The tide lifts the smallest pieces and carries them outward. The fallen blade shifts again, and a faint cloud rises from beneath it. The cloud is not mud alone. It contains bacterial films, tiny fragments of kelp, disturbed shell dust, and minute animals too small to follow. A hydroid colony downstream opens wider into the cloud. Each small feeding head waits, then closes, taking something from the passing veil. The fallen blade feeds animals that never touch it. It changes the water, and the water passes the change along. You follow that veil as it leaves the hollow and slides between two kelp bases. The root is darker now because the last surface color is draining from the sky above the islands. The canopy has become a single moving ceiling. Its individual blades can still be sensed, but not easily separated. They make the whole understory feel enclosed, green, black, and calm. The fish that moved through the middle water earlier have settled lower. A few young pollock hover near the stems, facing into the ebb, taking only what passes very close. They no longer travel across wide openings unless a shadow covers the way. Their bodies hold a soft dusk color, not silver now, but smoke gray and olive. A shrimp steps from one crack to another with its antennae fully spread. It touches the water ahead, then touches the rock, then pauses. In this dimness, touch becomes a kind of sight. Chemistry also becomes more important. The water carries faint signatures from torn kelp, grazing animals, exposed rock, and plankton moving with the tide. A shrimp can read some of those signatures with sensitive hairs and mouthparts. A fish can sense vibrations with the lateral line along its body. An anemone can respond to contact, dissolved food, and the rhythm of current. The forest does not become blind at dusk. It simply uses older senses. You drift past a basalt wall where red algae hang in loose, dark fronds. Their color has almost disappeared, but their shapes remain. A small crab climbs through them, lifting one leg at a time, testing each branch before shifting weight. Above it, a sea urchin emerges from a crevice, its spines decorated with bits of shell and kelp. The urchin has carried its own shadow with it. Tiny tube feet extend between the spines, placing and replacing the fragments across its upper surface. This covering may help it blend into the floor, or shade it from light, or simply collect because its tube feet hold what they find. In the evening forest, the urchin looks less like an animal than a moving piece of the seabed. It edges toward the fallen blade in the hollow, but does not reach it yet. The current strengthens enough to lift the blade's far edge again. The crab riding on it braces against the motion. When the kelp settles, the crab tears off another softened piece and brings it inward. Nothing here wastes the day's growth. Even the old blade's raggedness becomes useful. A small tear lets a grazer begin. A fold gives shelter to shrimp. A pocket beneath the blade traps fine particles. A drifting edge brushes the rock and knocks loose more edible film. The canopy's afterlife is not separate from the forest. It is one of the forest's methods. A faint sparkle appears in the water beside the torn blade. It is so small that it might be mistaken for a trick of the eye. Then another point flashes near the shrimp's antennae. Then a third, higher in the flow, bright blue-green and gone almost as soon as it appears. The first bioluminescent plankton are answering movement. They are not lighting the forest like lamps. They are making brief points, each one a tiny response to disturbance in the water. A shrimp flicks backward, and a few sparks follow the path of its tail. A kelp edge lifts, brushes the current, and a thin scatter of blue-green flecks appears along the moving line. Then the darkness closes around them again. Bioluminescence in coastal water often comes from tiny plankton, including dinoflagellates. Many produce light when their cell membranes are disturbed by motion. A wave, a fish, a hand, a shrimp, or a moving blade can trigger a short chemical glow. The light is made inside the cell by reactions involving oxygen and specialized molecules. It is quick, efficient, and delicate. Here, beneath the FAROE Kelp canopy, it appears only as a soft punctuation. The forest does not brighten. It murmurs with single sparks. You remain near the hollow and watch the glow appear only where something moves. Still water stays dark. Disturbed water answers. The crab tears at the blade, and a few points flash beside its claws. An amphipod darts away, leaving a dotted curve that fades behind it. A young fish turns sharply near a stipe, and a narrow arc of light marks the turn. Each glow is brief, but together they reveal paths that darkness would otherwise hide. The evening forest has begun to draw movement in blue-green ink. The effect is quiet enough that the darkness feels deeper afterward. When the sparks fade, the surrounding water seems older and more still. The basalt slope below the hollow continues downward, and the kelp begins to open slightly. You follow the dim glow as it appears and disappears along the ebbing flow, not toward the surface, and not back to the clearing, but into a deeper stand where dusk has settled first. The kelp stipes grow farther apart here. Their holdfasts remain strong, but the canopy overhead is less continuous than it was above the scar. Open water shows between blades, though little light comes through now. The forest is nearing a lower part of its range. It is not ended, but it has thinned enough that the rock between plants feels more exposed. Red algae become more prominent along the slope. Sponges appear as pale patches on shaded stone. Small anemones occupy cracks where the ebb current brings food. Shell gravel lies in longer ribbons, because fewer holdfasts interrupt the movement of loose material. This is the deepening edge of the kelp forest, but the edge is not a hard line. It is a gradual change in balance. Where enough light reaches the rock, young kelp can grow. where winter darkness is too long, or the water too turbid, or grazing too steady, kelp becomes sparse. The lower limit depends on many things at once. Depth matters because seawater absorbs light. Particles matter because cloudy water shortens the reach of the sun. Season matters because northern winter reduces the time and strength of daylight. Grazers matter because young kelp must survive long enough to rise above the rock. Around the Faroes, cold Atlantic water can be clear, but the islands are also swept by weather, tides, and suspended matter from storms. A forest may reach deeper on one slope than another. It may grow thick in a sheltered sound and sparse near a scoured headland. It may shift after a strong winter, then recover in brighter seasons if spores settle well. The lower edge is a living threshold, not a wall. You pass a kelp plant that is shorter than those above. Its stipe is sturdy, but its blade is smaller, more torn, and less lifted into the dim water. Near its base, red algae cover much of the rock, forming a low understory without much canopy above. A sponge spreads over a shaded face like a pale yellow crust. Water moves through the sponge constantly, though the body itself hardly seems to move. A brittle star extends one arm across the sponge's edge, then curls away from it. The animals here are not replacing kelp exactly. They are using the space where kelp is less dominant. This boundary zone is mixed. Part forest, part rocky reef, part detritus lane. The torn blade from above, or another like it, enters this zone as a visitor from the canopy. You see it ahead now, larger than the scraps before, sliding low over the shell gravel. It has been released from the hollow by a stronger pulse of ebb. The small crab is no longer visible on it. Perhaps it let go upstream. Perhaps it remains hidden under a fold. The blade travels with the current, turning slowly, its edges lifting and falling. It does not float upward. It has become heavy with water, grazing marks, and decay. It drifts down slope, following the same route that fine particles take toward the dim boundary below the last strong stems. We follow this blade. The standing forest remains behind and above, but the blade carries part of it forward. It is a moving piece of canopy, a strip of late summer, a parcel of stored sunlight entering deeper shade. As it slides over the rock, animals respond along its path. A shrimp steps aside, then follows its edge for a short distance. Two amphipods cling to a torn fold and ride with it. A small fish dips toward it, investigates, and returns to a stipe. The blade crosses a patch of shell gravel and briefly smooths the current over it. Fine grains lift at the front edge and settle in the lee behind the kelp. For a moment, the blade creates its own small weather. It casts shadow, it blocks flow, it traps particles, it carries passengers. It releases dissolved matter into the water around it. Even detached, it is still structuring the seafloor. A faint bioluminescent shimmer appears where the blade's edge rubs through suspended plankton. The glow is not continuous. It breaks into small points, then disappears. The blade turns over a dark stone, catches on a rough corner, and stops. The current presses it flat. Its upper surface folds around the rock, and the torn edge lifts like a quiet flag. Several amphipods loosen from the fold and move across the kelp tissue. One drops to the basalt beneath. A shrimp approaches from downstream, working against the flow. Its antennae meet the blade before its body does. It pauses, tasting the water around the kelp, then climbs onto the surface. The blade has reached the lower edge of the forest's influence. Above it, kelp still stands in scattered stems. Below it, the slope becomes more open, with red algae, sponges, shell sand, and darker exposed rock. The standing plants no longer make a complete roof. They make a broken shadow. You can look back upslope and see their blades as a dark ceiling in pieces shifting with the ebb. Downslope, the water opens into a dimmer field. The fallen blade lies between those two worlds. It is food from one layer delivered to another. Kelp forests export material this way all through the year, especially when storms tear blades and whole plants free. Some fragments remain nearby and feed animals in the understory. Some drift into deeper channels. Some strand on shores. Some sink into places where light cannot support large algae at all. In each case, the kelp carries carbon fixed by photosynthesis into another food web. The forest feeds beyond its own roots, though kelp has no roots in the soil-bound sense. It gives outward by breaking. The blade on the rock begins to attract a small gathering, not a crowd, and not quickly. A snail turns toward it from the red algae. A few amphipods concentrate along the torn margin. The shrimp walks over the surface, picking at films too fine to see. A small crab appears from beneath a stone lip and places one claw on the edge. There is no contest in the dramatic sense. There is only arrival by scent, contact, and current. The blade's chemical signature spreads downstream. Animals that can use it begin to find it. Those that cannot use it remain in their own lanes, filtering water, grazing rock, or resting in cracks. A sea urchin farther upslope moves in the same general direction, but its progress is very slow. It may reach the blade later, or not. The ebb may move the blade again before then. The boundary zone is full of such unfinished meetings. A piece of food drifts. A grazer turns. A current strengthens. A shelter leaves before it can be fully used. Nothing is guaranteed, yet everything is connected through motion. You settle just below the caught blade, looking upward toward the thinning kelp. The forest above looks older from here. Its canopy is darker, its stems silhouetted, its shadows overlapping with evening. The clearing where the old kelp fell is no longer visible, but its effects are still part of the same system. A missing holdfast changed flow. The flow carried particles. Some particles fed animals. A detached blade moved from the canopy to this lower edge. Spores, fragments, larvae, and grazers all travel through the corridors made by basalt and tide. The kelp forest is not a still object. It is an exchange. The tide has turned fully now. There is no question in the particles anymore. They travel in the ebb direction through the same underwater corridors that carried floodwater earlier. The path has reversed, and with it, the feeding faces of many animals have changed. Anemones downstream of the standing kelp now open into the stronger flow. Hydroids on the opposite sides of stipes catch more food than they did before. Loose detritus shifts from one ledge to another. The same rock rooms are being used from a different angle. A sponge at the lower edge filters water that has just passed through the forest above. That water carries plankton, dissolved kelp compounds, tiny fecal pellets, bacterial cells, and fragments of broken tissue. The sponge does not know the canopy in any visible way, yet the canopy changes what enters its pores. The forest's influence continues after the blades are out of sight. A brittle star on the shell sand lifts two arms into the ebb. The arms move like fine, jointed ribbons. They gather particles that may have begun as kelp, plankton, or stirred sediment from the clearing. The brittle star draws the arms inward, cleaning food from them, then extends them again. It lives at the edge of the forest, but the forest reaches it through the water. The caught blade pulls loose suddenly, though not violently. The current folds it around the stone one more time, then frees the torn edge. It slides a short distance downslope and settles in a shallow trough of shell sand. The animals that were on it respond in different ways. The shrimp lifts and swims backward, leaving a few bioluminescent sparks behind its tail. Some amphipods stay with the blade. The small crab releases and remains by the stone, claws held close. The snail, still approaching, continues over the rock as if the destination has merely shifted. The blade has moved only a few feet, but the small community around it has been rearranged. This is a gentle setback in the boundary zone. A gathering begins. The tide moves the resource. Some animals follow. Others return to their surfaces. The forest offers, removes, and offers again. The blade now lies partly on shell sand and partly against red algae. Its shape makes a low tent under one folded edge. A small fish enters that shadow, pauses, and exits from the other side. A shrimp soon takes the same route. The blade is becoming a temporary room on the lower slope. Unlike a holdfast, it is not anchored for years. Unlike a basalt crack, it is not fixed. Its value comes from being movable, edible, and brief. Many animals in the kelp forest are skilled at using brief things: a passing shadow, a loosened scrap, a particle line, a temporary shelter under a blade, a pulse of plankton after the tide turns. The ecosystem is ancient, but much of its daily life depends on short opportunities. That combination gives the forest its particular calm. It is patient on the scale of seasons, and responsive on the scale of seconds. Above you, a final faint brightness lingers near the surface. It is not enough to color the forest clearly, it only gives the upper water a slight grey-green depth. The kelp blades, seen from below, move like darker water within dark water. Bioluminescent points appear more easily now because the background has dimmed. A fish turns, and a few sparks open around its body. A shrimp flicks, and a tiny blue trace forms and fades. The fallen blade lifts at one corner, and scattered points answer the moving edge. The glow reveals motion, then leaves no mark. It is not a guide in the human sense. It does not show the whole way. It only says, something moved here. Then the sea takes the message back. You drift beside the blade as it begins to settle more firmly into the trough. Shell sand gathers along its lower edge. The current presses part of it down, while the upper fold continues to breathe with the water. A small amphipod disappears under the fold. Another emerges, carrying a loosened piece of tissue. The snail reaches the blade at last and begins to graze across its surface. Its path is slow, steady, and direct. It does not matter that the blade has moved. The chemical trace remains, the contact is real, the food is here now. A crab returns from the stone lip and grips the lower edge. Its claws work at the softened tissue, tear in tiny pieces free. Behind it, a brittle star arm reaches from the shell sand toward the shadow beneath the blade. The blade has become a meeting place for grazers, scavengers, and opportunists. It also shades the sand below, changing the behavior of smaller animals hidden there. Under the folded kelp, the shell sand holds its own small night. A tiny burrowing amphipod rises from between two grains, touches the shadow, and sinks again. A thin worm extends from the sand, no thicker than thread, then draws back beneath the blade. The shade is temporary, but the animals respond to it as if a roof has arrived. For them, the fallen kelp has changed the boundary between open sand and shelter. It has lowered the light, slowed the water, and gathered particles along its edge. A small mound of shell dust begins to form where the current meets the blade. Each grain is moved only a little, but the shape of the trough changes. This is how soft ground remembers passing things. Not with scars, like basalt, but with small ridges and buried traces. The blade lifts slightly, and a few blue-green sparks appear beneath the fold. The glow fades before the animals have moved very far. In the new darkness, the shrimp under the kelp touches the sand with careful legs. It picks at the line where softened tissue meets shell grains. There, food collects from more than one source. Bits of kelp, bacteria, diatoms, animal waste, and plankton all gather in the same slow seam. The seam becomes a feeding edge, drawn by the shape of the fallen blade. A brittle star arm reaches farther under it, feeling the underside without exposing the central body. The arm coils, uncoils, and draws something inward. The animal remains mostly hidden, but the blade has extended its feeding space. A small crab backs under the fold, then turns sideways to fit beneath it. Its shell presses close to the kelp tissue, and its legs stir the sand lightly. A faint cloud rises, glows in two brief points, and drifts downstream. The cloud carries material from the trough toward animals waiting beyond the blade. A sponge lower on the rock receives some of it through thousands of tiny pores. A sea squirt colony filters another part where the current brushes a stone overhang. The fallen blade feeds by being eaten, but also by being disturbed. Every movement around it releases something into the water. The tide takes those loosened pieces and makes them available to lives that never touch the kelp. This is the quiet reach of a kelp forest beyond its standing stems. The blade is no longer attached, but it still belongs to the system. It is becoming less plant and more pathway. Carbon fixed in summer light is passing into claws, mouths, bacteria, filters, and sand. Some of it will become animal tissue, some will be breathed back into the water as CO2. Some will sink deeper as fine dark particles, too small to follow with the eye. Some may be buried for a while in the shell sand, held below the moving surface. The lower edge of the FAROE Kelp forest is full of these transfers. A blade falls, and the boundary zone receives it. A crab tears, and smaller animals gather. A microbe softens, and the tissue becomes easier to shred. A filter feeder opens, and the water carries the blade outward in smaller forms. The standing forest above grows from light, but the dim edge grows from exchange. You drift just beyond the trough, where the shell sand thins against darker basalt. Here, the rock rises in low humps, covered with red algae and patches of sponge. The kelp stems are fewer now, and each one stands more clearly alone. Their shadows do not merge into a full canopy. They pass over the slope like long dark hands, separated by open dimness. A short kelp plant bends with the ebb, its blade torn into ribbons near the end. The ribbons stream away from the stipe, each one drawing a separate shadow. Between those shadows, a small anemone opens on the rock. Its tentacles are pale, almost colorless in the evening water. It faces the current, waiting for particles released from the forest above. The anemone does not need the canopy to stand directly overhead. It only needs the water that has passed through it. That water arrives carrying the taste of kelp, plankton, silt, and living movement. A small fish rests near the anemone, close enough to the rock to avoid the stronger flow. Its fins make nearly invisible adjustments. It takes one drifting speck, then settles again behind a bump of basalt. As the night gathers, movement becomes more economical. The fish does not cross wide spaces without reason. The crab does not leave the blade while food is under its claws. The shrimp pauses often, letting its antennae read before its feet commit. The forest has not grown sleepy, exactly. It has become careful. Every animal is working within the lower light, the outgoing tide, and the shelter available nearby. The fallen blade shifts again, but only along one edge. Sand has begun to weigh down the lower part. The upper fold still rises and falls, opening a dark slit beneath it. Inside that slit, small bodies move in and out like thoughts half seen. A pale isopod crawls along the inner surface, stops, and begins to feed. An amphipod approaches from the outer edge and slips under the fold. The crab remains near the torn margin, tearing and holding. The brittle star arm withdraws, then returns from a slightly different angle. Nothing owns the blade. It is shared because it is too large for any one small animal to use alone. Its usefulness is spread across surfaces, folds, chemistry, and time. If the ebb grows stronger, it may move again before morning. If it catches more sand, it may remain through the night. If another kelp fragment arrives, the trough may become a small detritus patch. The outcome depends on the next pulse of water. That is the gentle uncertainty of this boundary. The forest above has stronger structure. Holdfasts grip basalt, and stipes hold their places through many tides. But here, near the lower edge, some of the most important structures are temporary. A blade rests for an hour, a particle line forms for a few minutes, a bioluminescent trace lasts less than a breath. Yet these brief things still guide feeding, shelter, and movement. The oldest landscapes often work through the smallest temporary changes. You follow the current a little farther down slope, leaving the blade behind but not its influence. The water now carries a faint veil from the trough. It moves over red algae, around sponges, and into a narrow channel of shell sand. In that channel, tiny dark pellets roll along the bottom. Some come from grazers feeding above. Some come from filter feeders packaging the water into heavier particles. These pellets sink more easily than loose fragments. They are another way the forest moves material downward. A sea cucumber, small and dark, lies partly buried beside the sand channel. Its feeding tentacles spread over the surface like soft fingers. One by one, they gather sand and organic coating, then curl inward to the mouth. The sea cucumber is not dramatic in movement. It processes the settled world slowly. What the tide lays down, it sorts. What the forest sheds, it may eventually touch. This kind of animal turns loose material into another stage of the ecosystem. It takes in grains, films, and small organic particles. It leaves behind reworked sediment, altered by digestion and movement. The bottom is not merely a place where debris arrives, it is a place where debris is transformed. The channel curves around a dark basalt block. On the block's shaded side, a sponge forms a thick cushion, pale grey in the dimness. Several small brittle stars live beneath its lower edge. Only their arms show, extended into the outgoing flow. The sponge filters constantly. The brittle stars gather larger particles. The sea cucumber works the sand below. Three different feeding methods share the same stream. The water passes from one body to another, and each body takes a different size of the passing world. Above them, the last kelp stems make a broken pattern against the dim upper water. The standing forest is thinning, but it is still present as a roof in pieces. A torn blade from one of the lower plants flicks in the current. Its edge brushes a cloud of plankton, and the blue-green sparks appear again. This time they show the blade's shape for an instant. A dark ribbon, a bright outline, then nothing. It shows that the water is full of small, responsive lives. Even when the eye sees only shadow, the water is inhabited by touch and chemistry. A copepod jumps, and a single point flashes where it disturbed a cell. A shrimp turns below, and a short scatter answers. The outgoing tide pulls these small lights along the slope, then disperses them. The forest's night is not a black curtain. It is a dim field of signals, most of them too small to last. You drift lower until the kelp behind you is clearly above, not around you. The slope is now mostly rock, red algae, sponges, anemones and shell sand. Kelp still appears in scattered plants, but each one feels like an outpost. Their holdfasts are solid where they occur, dripping rough basalt in places with enough light. Between them, other forms take more space. A crust of pink coralline algae covers one flat rock. It grows slowly, hardening its tissues with calcium carbonate. In the dim Faroe water, its color is muted, but its texture is clear. It forms a rough living pavement where soft algae do not cover the surface. Young limpets graze across it, leaving narrow, clean paths. A small chiton crosses one edge, its plates flexing as it follows the rock. The coralline crust creates a different kind of attachment surface. Some larvae prefer it. Some algae settle near it. Some grazers maintain it by clearing faster-growing films from its surface. Again, the boundary is a conversation. The lower kelp edge is not simply the place where kelp stops. It is where kelp, red algae, grazers, filter feeders, and geology balance one another. If the water were clearer for longer, kelp might extend farther down this slope. If storms carried more sediment, the lower plants might lose light sooner. If grazers increased strongly, young recruits might be cropped before they rose. If the basalt offered fewer rough faces, holdfasts would find fewer lasting places. The edge exists because all these conditions meet here, in a particular way. It is a line made of many causes, and the tide crosses it without noticing. You turn gently with the current and look back toward the trough. The fallen blade is now a dark shape in the upper dimness. Its fold still lifts and lowers, but the details are softened by distance. A few faint sparks appear around it, showing continued movement. Animals are still feeding there. Sand is still gathering. The blade is still becoming smaller, even while it looks whole from here. From this distance, the afterlife of the canopy appears calm and inevitable, but close to it, each bite, each particle, and each sheltering movement had its own direction. This is true of the entire forest. From far away, it seems like one dark, swaying mass. From within, it is made of small choices and slow transformations. A gap where old kelp fell. A holdfast filled with hidden runes. A feeding lane drawn by particles. A dusk shimmer made by disturbed plankton. A fallen blade giving the canopy to the lower slope. All of these are connected by the same water, now moving steadily seaward. The ebb tide gathers strength, but it remains smooth in this sheltered sound. It pulls along basalt corridors, past shell gravel, over scars, through holdfasts, and down the mixed lower edge. The direction is now fully reversed from the beginning of the descent. Particles that once entered the forest now leave it. They carry signs of everything they passed. A little mucus from worm tubes, a trace of grazed kelp, a thread of silt from the clearing, a fragment of diatom film from exposed basalt. A few bacterial cells growing on softened plant tissue. The water is a record, but only for a moment, then it mixes, disperses, and becomes ordinary sea again. You move with it, not far, just enough to feel the whole forest breathing behind you. The kelp canopy is no longer directly overhead. It has become an upslope shadow, broad and layered. Its motion still affects the water here, but less strongly. The The lower zone has its own rhythm. Sponges filter, anemones wait. Brittle stars extend and withdraw. Sea cucumbers sort the sand. Small fish hold close to low rocks. Shrimp work along cracks and fallen debris, reading the night with their antennae. The visual world has narrowed, but the ecological world has widened. What began as a forest of blades is now a web of transfers. Light became kelp. Kelp became shelter. Shelter gathered animals. Animals grazed, filtered, and hid. Tide moved fragments. Fragments fed the dim edge. The sequence is simple when spoken slowly, but endless in detail. A loose piece of kelp tissue drifts past you, much smaller than the fallen blade. It turns once, catches briefly against a sponge, then releases. A brittle star arm curls toward it, misses, and returns to the current. The fragment continues down slope, shrinking into darkness. It may lodge under a stone, it may be eaten by amphipods, it may break into particles and enter a filter feeder, it may travel beyond the kelp forest entirely. No single piece carries the whole story, but every piece carries part of it. The forest exports itself in fragments. Some are large, like the blade in the trough. Some are fine, like invisible dissolved matter moving through sponge bodies. Some are living, like spores and larvae. Some are mineral, like shell grains shifted by crabs and tide. The lower edge receives all of them, then sends them onward. You descend along a slight slope where shell sand gives way to darker gravel. The grains here are mixed with volcanic chips, black and grey among pale broken shells. This mixture shows the meeting of island rock and marine life. Basalt wears down slowly from cliffs, ledges, and submerged stone. Shells break from mussels, barnacles, snails, and other animals. The tide grinds them together, sorts them by weight, and lays them in ribbons. The seabed becomes a quiet archive of both geology and biology. A small flatfish lies on the sand, almost invisible until it moves one fin. Its body matches the mottled bottom, grey-brown with pale flecks. It does not chase the drifting kelp fragment. It remains settled, waiting for small animals in or just above the sediment. When a shrimp steps too near, the flatfish lifts slightly, then settles again without following. The moment passes softly. The fish's stillness returns, and its outline disappears into the gravel. At the edge of the same patch, a young gadoid fish hovers upright beside a stone. It faces the ebb with gentle corrections of its fins. Its eyes catch the last faint light, then dull again. It takes a small coke pod from the flow and sinks closer to the rock. The night has made the water column less open for some fish and more useful for others. Feeding continues, but with shorter movements. The kelp forest's lower edge encourages this quiet economy. There is food in the flow, but shelter is spaced farther apart. A fish moves from stone to stone, not from stem to stem. A shrimp crosses between algae clumps, not between dense holdfasts. A snail follows chemical traces, not strong visual lines. The habitat has opened, and behavior has adjusted. A small anemone, set deep in a crack, closes around a particle and then opens again. Its tentacles move slowly in the ebb. A cluster of hydroids nearby bends downstream, their tiny feeding heads facing the flow. They are attached to a low red alga rather than a kelp stipe. At this depth, attachment points change. Where tall kelp is sparse, smaller algae, stones, shells, and animal colonies become the platforms. The forest's architecture becomes lower and more patchy. It still has layers, but the layers are compressed against the rock. Above, there are separated blades. At mid-height, there are scattered fish. Near the bottom, there are sponges, algae, hydroids, brittle stars, and sand dwellers. Below that, within the sediment, there are worms, small crustaceans, bacteria, and buried shells. Even as the canopy thins, the vertical order remains. It is simply written closer to the seabed. You pause beside a basalt ridge that marks a natural terrace. On its upper side, a few kelp holdfasts still grip the rock. On its lower side, no tall kelp stands. The change is not sharp, but this ridge makes it easier to see. The upper face receives slightly more light and catches less settling sand. The lower face is shaded by the terrace itself. and receives more drifting sediment. A kelp spore landing above has a better chance than one landing below. A red alga may tolerate the lower face better. A sponge may thrive where light is less useful and water flow remains steady. The ridge is small, but it divides opportunities. Geology does not command life loudly here. It suggests possibilities, and living things answer where they can. The Faroes are built from layers of old volcanic flows, stacked and worn by weather and sea. Underwater, those layers become ledges, shelves, and broken steps. Kelp attaches to the steps. Sediment gathers in the hollows. Currents accelerate around the corners. Animals choose the surfaces that match their bodies. The landscape's ancient origin is still shaping this evening's feeding. A crab under a kelp blade, a sponge on a shaded wall, and a spore on exposed stone all respond to old lava. That thought settles gently in the darkness. The forest is not only alive in the present, it is growing on a form made long before it. The tide moves across that form, and the living forest rises where the stone allows. A faint line of particles passes over the terrace from the kelp above. It is denser than the surrounding water. Perhaps the fallen blade released more material. Perhaps the clearing upstream stirred under a stronger pulse. Perhaps many small sources have merged into one visible thread. The line crosses the ridge and descends into the lower side. Filter feeders open along its path. A sea squirt colony takes water in through small round openings. A sponge below it receives the same water moments later. A small, brittle star, hidden beneath the terrace lip, extends an arm into the same thread and gathers what neither colony takes. The particle line is not food for one animal, but a shared current, divided by body size and patience. Some pieces are caught by tentacles, some pass into pores, some settle into sand, where worms and sea cucumbers will find them later. Some continue outward, leaving the kelp forest as a faint memory in moving water. You stay with this line because it has become the forest's final visible thread. It connects the clearing above, the holdfast rooms, the fallen blade, and the lower reef in one slow descent. The tide is now fully turned, and the corridor that once welcomed water inward is carrying the forest away. Not away in loss, exactly. Away as exchange. Every forest does this, in its own form. A land forest drops leaves into soil and streams. A kelp forest lets blades loosen into tide, sand, filter feeders, and deeper shadow. The Faroe Sound holds both firmness and release. The salt remains, dark and old, while living surfaces appear, grow, tear, settle, and begin again. The particle thread thins as it crosses the lower terrace. The sea squirt colony continues to pump, though nothing about it looks busy. Each small body draws water through a soft inner chamber, removing edible particles too small for claws or teeth. The water leaves clearer than it entered, but not unchanged. It has passed through life, and that passage matters. Below the sea squirts, the sponge takes in what remains. Its surface seems still, like pale stone, but inside it, cells beat tiny flagella, pulling the sea through branching canals. A sponge is a quiet engine of filtering. It turns suspended traces into animal tissue, waste, and altered chemistry. The kelp canopy above, though distant now, helps supply that passing mixture. The sponge does not need to see the forest. It only needs the forest to shed. A shrimp moves across the lower terrace, following the edge of the particle line. Its antennae sweep through the water where the thread is thickest. It stops at a patch of red algae and picks at something caught among the fronds. Then it retreats under a stone ledge, carrying the small piece with it. This is the final escalation of the evening, if escalation can be quiet. The whole ecosystem has become legible as a flow. The standing kelp is no longer the only center. The center is everywhere the water carries matter from one form to another. A gap in the canopy opened light. A loosened blade moved food. A tide reversal changed feeding faces. A lower ridge separated kelp from sponge, red algae from shell sand, and temporary shelter from permanent stone. Now all of those changes meet in the same outgoing current. You look back up the slope, and the forest appears as a dark, layered roof. The individual stems are almost gone from sight. Only the nearest lower plants remain distinct, bending in separated arcs. Their blades stream with the ebb, torn tips pointing seaward. Between them, small sparks still appear when plankton meet motion. A fish turns once in the dim water, and blue-green points open around its tail. The light lasts less than a heartbeat. Then the forest is dark again. Those brief flashes are enough to show that night has not emptied the water. It has simply lowered the scale of seeing. The kelp forest is now read by touch, scent, vibration, and the smallest light. A crab under the fallen blade tears again at softened tissue. You can no longer see the blade clearly, but you can see the result. A faint cloud rises from the trough above and slides down to the terrace. The cloud enters the same route as the particle line. A hydroid colony opens along one branch of red algae. A brittle star arm bends toward it. A sea cucumber's feeding tentacles move a little faster over the sand. The fallen blade has sent another pulse into the lower edge. The blade itself may stay there through the night, or it may lift again with a stronger tide. Its future remains open. If it remains, sand will gather around its lower fold. Amphipods will graze along the torn margin. Bacteria will soften the thick midrib. A crab may enlarge the first ragged holes into wider openings. By morning, the blade may be thinner, darker, and more folded into the seabed. If it moves, it may cross the terrace and settle lower still. It may catch in another hollow beneath sponges and small anemones. It may travel out of the sound beyond the last kelp, carrying its stored summer into deeper water. The forest does not decide. The tide decides, and even the tide is shaped by slope, stone, moon, and weather beyond view. You drift lower, just to the base of the terrace, where the current softens behind a basalt block. Here, a small eddy holds some of the outgoing material briefly before letting it go. Particles circle once, then twice, then slip free downstream. The eddy is temporary, but it acts like a resting place. A lava drifting in that small swirl may touch rock instead of continuing into open water. A spore may settle where the current weakens against a rough surface. A pellet may drop into sand and become food for a buried worm. The shape of stone makes chance more likely in certain places. That is one of the quiet laws of this kelp forest. Basalt gives the current edges. The current gives living things routes. Living things alter those routes with bodies, holdfasts, blades, tubes, shells, and feeding. Nothing here is isolated, though everything seems calm. A small limpet clings to the lower face of the ridge. It has likely grazed this same patch many times, leaving faint paths across films too fine to notice. Its shell fits the rock, low and secure. Above it, a young red alga grows in a narrow seam. Below it, sponge covers the shaded stone. The limpet's grazing may keep the seam open or prevent another alga from taking it. The sponge's filtering may reduce the particles that settle nearby. The red alga may slow the water enough to catch more silt. Even at this small scale, the lower edge is a negotiation. The kelp forest's afterlife passes through all of them. You can feel the outgoing tide as a steady pressure now, not strong but consistent. It has gathered the evening into one direction. Shrimp face into it. Anemones open into it. Hydroids lean with it. Loose grains roll, stop, and roll again. The sound above the water is gone from this depth. There is only the close underwater murmur, the faint rasp of life on surfaces, and the nearly imagined crackle of small animals moving among shell fragments. The darkness is not empty. It is occupied by slow work. A flatfish lifts from the gravel and moves a short distance downslope. Its body leaves a shallow mark in the sand, then settles into another mottled patch. The mark begins to soften almost immediately as grains slide back. Soft sediment remembers differently from rock. It keeps an impression for a while, then lets the tide smooth it away. Basalt holds scars longer. The pale oval where the old kelp fell may remain visible until new growth covers it. The sand keeps only a passing outline. Both are forms of memory. One is clear and hard, one is loose and forgiving. The kelp forest contains both kinds, and the tide reads across them without pause. You turn gently, letting your view widen. The lower edge is no longer a place of arrival only. It is the place where everything from above becomes mixed with everything below. Standing kelp sends fragments downward. Red algae trap and release them. Sponges and sea squirts filter the fine share. Crabs and amphipods shred the larger pieces. Urchins graze surfaces opened by loss. Sea cucumbers sort what settles. Fish move between stones, taking what the current brings within reach. The whole system is less like a collection of separate creatures and more like a slow conversation. Basalt speaks in ledges, tide speaks in direction, season speaks in light, kelp speaks in shade, shelter, growth, and falling. Animals answer with feeding, hiding, grazing, filtering, and return. The conversation never becomes loud. It is written in movements smaller than a hand and in changes slower than a day. The evening deepens. The last grey-green light from the surface weakens until the upper canopy is nearly indistinguishable from the water around it. Only when a blade moves across plankton does its edge briefly appear in blue sparks, a dark ribbon, a scatter of light. Then nothing. The sparks do not make the forest bright, they make the darkness feel alive. They show that even near the lower limit, where kelp thins and vision fades, the water is full of response. A copepod jumps near your shoulder, and a single point of light opens and closes. A shrimp flicks under the ledge, leaving 3 small flashes in a curve. The particle thread that led you here is now almost invisible. It has spread into the lower water, divided among filters, sand, cracks, and current. Its clear line has become a wider haze. This is the final consequence of the tides turning. What was gathered becomes dispersed. What was visible becomes dissolved into the system. The forest does not end at one boundary. It fades outward in matter, chemistry, and small feeding. You remain at the terrace edge, no longer following any one animal. The shrimp continues its careful path under the stone. The brittle star continues to gather and withdraw. The sponge continues to filter. The sea cucumber continues to press the sand through soft tentacles. The fish behind the basalt block continues to hold position with small fin strokes. Each life is local. Each life is connected. Above them, somewhere out of sight, the clearing still waits beneath its moving window. The pale scar on the rock is receiving darkness now instead of light. The limpet may still cross it. The urchin may still graze its edge. Spores may pass over it in the outgoing tide, or they may pass later when the water turns again. Some may touch the newly opened basalt and remain. Most will not. That is not failure. That is how the forest searches. It sends many beginnings into many possible places. Some find clean stone, some meet grazers, some settle in too much shade. Some arrive where silt covers them before they grow. And somewhere, perhaps near the edge of the old Holdfast scar, one small beginning may hold. It would not look like a future canopy. It would look like almost nothing. A thin stage on stone. A point of attachment. A life smaller than the grazing marks around it. Yet from such small stages, the tall green-brown blades return. The next canopy, if it comes, will begin unseen. That thought rests gently over the whole slope. The forest above seems ancient because it sways as one dark roof. But it is always being made again from microscopic arrivals, torn spaces, and seasonal chances. Every strong stipe began as a hidden young form. Every holdfast room began as a tiny grip on rock. Every deep shadow began with a blade growing tall enough to cast it. The kelp forest is old in pattern, but young in many of its parts. It holds memory and renewal together. A final pulse of ebb moves over the terrace. Sand grains lift in a narrow sheet and settle again. The sponge's openings remain steady. The sea squirt colony continues its quiet pumping. A small anemone closes around something unseen. A brittle star arm coils inward, then reaches out once more. The lower edge accepts the pulse without disturbance. It has received tides for longer than any single kelp plant has stood. It will receive the next turn as well. The water that leaves now will be replaced later. When the tide turns again, particles will travel back through the corridors from another direction. Feeding fronts will become sheltered backs. Sheltered backs will become feeding fronts. The fallen blade may be lifted, shifted, or buried a little deeper. The clearing may receive another trace of silt, another grazer, another drifting spore. The holdfast rooms will open and close with each small change of flow. The forest's apparent stillness is made of these repetitions. Turn, feed, settle, lift, tear, grow, dim, glow. Again, you let the view become wider and softer. There is no need to choose a single creature now. The story has become the whole slope, from the upper canopy to the lower mixed reef. It began in green light beneath the surface, where kelp blades leaned with the last flood tide. It passed through shadow corridors, holdfast chambers, feeding lanes, a pale scar of loss, evening sparks, and a fallen blade carrying summer downward. Now it rests here, at the dim edge, where kelp is still present but no longer dominant. The forest above is a darker roof. The lower reef is a quiet floor. Between them, the outgoing tide carries everything that can move. A faint blue spark appears near the terrace and fades before you can follow it. Another opens near the distant blade, then disappears. The darkness after each spark feels deeper, but also kinder. It is not an empty blackness. It is the cover under which shrimp emerge, crabs feed, worms extend, and tiny plankton answer touch with light. The FAROE Kelp forest has entered night without ending its work. It has simply changed the way its work can be seen. The basalt ledges remain beneath all of it, old lava cooled and broken, now covered by soft life and passing shadow. The rock gives places to hold. The tide gives motion. The northern light gives a season of growth, then withdraws. Kelp rises, shelters, tears, and falls. Animals make use of each stage. Nothing here is wasted quickly. Nothing here is kept forever. The forest is a balance between holding on and letting go. A blade grips until it cannot. A fragment drifts until it catches. A particle settles until the tide lifts it. A spore floats until it finds rock or continues into darkness. The lower edge is where that balance is easiest to feel. Above, the canopy seems secure. Below, the open slope seems quiet. Here, between them, everything is becoming something else. You rest in the slow outward flow and let the scene settle. The last kelp stems sway above as separate silhouettes. The red algae lie low against basalt. The sponges filter without hurry. The shell sand receives small traces from the water. The fallen blade, now dim and far, continues to feed whoever has found it. The pale clearing higher in the forest is hidden, but not gone. It remains a question in the darkness. Perhaps new kelp will take hold there when the next season turns. Perhaps red algae will keep the space low and open. Perhaps grazers will cross it so often that the basalt stays pale a little longer. The forest does not answer tonight. It only keeps moving softly with the tide. And somewhere above, on the open scar where the old holdfast let go, a spore may be settling now.